Hello and happy Thursday. Welcome to FP's virtual dialogue, Investing in the Planet. We'll explore why climate investment is most vital in developing countries, why this is of global importance, and how developed nations are generating resources for climate smart growth. I'm Ravi Agrawal, the editor-in-chief of Foreign Policy, and it's my pleasure to be your host for the next 60 minutes or so. We have some really smart perspectives to bring you with climate ministers from Jamaica, a climate envoy from Denmark, and as well as President Biden's special assistant for climate and energy. Now, the debate over climate mitigation has a very familiar, tired impasse. Climate change tends to affect developing countries the most, and yet they're the ones least equipped to handle it and also have a growth imperative to contend with. There's a growing understanding that developed nations need to invest a greater share in climate action to support developing countries, but we're still nowhere near a sustainable global plan. So our conversation today will address how global leaders can work together toward tangible climate goals and investments, and how those investments can be directed to where they are needed most and where they can make the biggest impact. Thank you for tuning in, and a big thanks to Climate Investment Funds for partnering with us on this program. We're also excited to launch today the second season of our podcast, Heat of the Moment, a 10-part series by FP Studios in partnership with the CIF, where we focus on ordinary people around the globe who are doing extraordinary things on the front lines of climate change. You can find out more at foreignpolicy.com/podcasts and tune in wherever you get your podcasts. Now, before we get started, we want to make sure we can hear from you, our audience. I can see many of you have joined in already, hundreds also on the Q&A tab. We've reserved a portion of this event for questions from you all over the world. Here's how to write us. If you're on Zoom, click on the Q&A button below, submit your questions, tell us your name, organization, where you're writing from. And if you're joining us on the phone or watching the live stream, you can email us. The address is events@foreignpolicy.com. Of course, we encourage you to chime in on social media as well. That is #investinginclimate. Okay, let's get started. I have a terrific guest to help us frame our conversation for this hour. Mafalda Duarte is CEO of the Climate Investment Funds. CIF is an $8.5 billion multilateral fund supporting climate action in 72 developing countries since 2009. CIF works to accelerate investment and innovation in clean technology, energy access, and climate resilience in developing and middle-income countries. Mafalda, welcome.
Thank you, Ravi. Pleasure being here with you and everyone connected virtually.
Indeed. Well, it's great to have you on. Look, I'd like to begin just by framing this. Why are we here, and set out the stakes of, especially in the lead up to COP26, why is this debate over climate finance as important and as urgent as it is?
Thank you, Ravi. So we are here today because, as we know, we are facing breathtaking challenges, and we actually need to mobilize support towards greater climate ambition and action. This COVID-19 pandemic, as we also know very well, has caused the losses of more than 4.5 million people, 250 million jobs, and actually reckoning with some numbers, the first reversal in poverty reduction in over 2 decades. And this pandemic caught the majority of people by surprise, but we were already being given warnings that the health systems worldwide were unprepared to handle a pandemic and how impactful those could be. We have to understand that we are being given similar warnings regarding climate change, through record global temperatures, through raging wildfires, through historical floods and destructive storms that we see so often in the news. So hopefully COVID-19 has brought home to most people that no nation, no country exists in a vacuum. We all live in this planet, and what happens abroad has impacts at home. And hopefully, COVID-19 has also been a wake-up call to many about our vulnerability to shocks. And the fact that the climate crisis is an imminent and even much larger threat than COVID-19. But the interesting thing is that COVID-19 has also shown that when there's strong political will, a lot can be accomplished. If we just realize that more than $16 trillion have been invested as a response to this crisis, and let us remember the historical mobilization of governments and businesses that led to not one, but several COVID-19 vaccines. So this shows that we can do it. We can take unprecedented action. At the same time, we need to understand that much like there's no solution to the pandemic in one country until there's progress achieved globally, there will also not be a solution to our climate crisis without global action and a key focus in developing countries, which is the theme of what we are talking about here today. And why is that? Because developing countries actually are on track to run on 70% of the world's energy supply. The energy sector is responsible for 3/4 of global greenhouse gas emissions, and they represent 60% of total GDP. But it's also in developing countries where 2/3 of the forecasted $90 trillion of investments in infrastructure will happen in the years to come. These infrastructure investments cannot lock us in a high carbon, low resilient future. If these investments are not done properly, that's the way we are heading. So on the other hand, we also know that most of the spending that has occurred in the context of the COVID-19 to mitigate the effects of this crisis has been invested in developed countries, not in developing countries. Even though developing countries are being disproportionately impacted by the current pandemic and by the climate crisis, and they are facing severe fiscal constraints that are preventing them from adequately responding to both. So our conversation here today is really, really critical. We need to mobilize that political will, that leadership that we have been seeing in the context of COVID-19, and ensure that there are investments in lasting structural change, which is what climate change is asking for, in equitable climate action at a scale and a speed that we haven't seen before, bearing in mind that these transitions that are so much needed need to be socially just, and socially just not just across countries, but within countries as well. And again, I'm very confident that we can do it, and I will finish in a few seconds, because the climate investment funds are an example of it. We were actually established in the midst of the last financial crisis in 2008, 2009, and we actually have demonstrated that scarce public resources can actually achieve a great deal in developing countries by being enablers of much larger capital investment flows, of being enablers of policy and institutional changes that are lasting, that are structural. We have also demonstrated that these investments generate jobs, which is a lot of what the conversation is today in terms of the recovery to the pandemic. It generates jobs. In our energy portfolio, we have generated 6 million jobs, and it can add economic value to these communities and societies where these investments take place. So what we need to see now, as I was saying, what we need is to mobilize this will, this leadership, to make these investments in developing countries, because these investments in developing countries are actually investments in developed countries as well.
Right. Mafalda Duarte, the CEO of CIF, the Climate Investment Funds, thank you for that, those framing thoughts at the start of this event. You make some excellent points. We're going to bring you back towards the end of this event so we can go over the other discussions that we're about to have and try and come up with more of a roadmap towards COP26 in terms of what the world needs and what we need to focus on. But the broader point about how COVID-19 was a dress rehearsal of sorts for climate change is well taken. On the one hand, absolutely inspirational that we've developed vaccines as quickly as we have and deployed so much capital to help people in need and help countries in need. But on the other hand, the inequitable sort of distribution of vaccines is also a point of criticism. Mafalda, thank you for that. I'm delighted now to bring in our next guest, the Honorable Minister Pernell Charles Jr. He is Jamaica's Minister of Housing, Urban Renewal, Environment, and Climate Change. Welcome to the program, Minister Charles.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Great to have you on. Now, your country, Jamaica, was the first Caribbean nation to submit a strict climate action plan under the Paris Agreement. Very quickly, just walk us through whether you're on track to meet those goals.
So yes, we submitted our NDC in June 2020, and we had two main targets in the energy sector and the forestry sector. And this is all our thrust towards moving towards the resilient low carbon development by 2050. We are on track. This will see us pursuing actions that will lead to emission reductions of 25.4% unconditional and 28.5% with support of the international community relative to business as usual scenario. So we have really ambitious targets. And we've set those targets because we understand how important it is for the entire world, even the low emitters like us in Jamaica, to make our contribution to the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. This is aligned also with our national strategies. So our national plan as a country, Vision 2030, our climate change policy framework, our national energy policy, forestry policy, and also the strategic program for climate resilience is all embracing our NDC targets.
Minister Charles, when we talk about investment in climate finance, a big part of it is, okay, where does that money actually go? How do you allocate it? And so I guess in the Jamaican context, where do you need the money most, and in what way can it have the most impact?
So it takes cash to care. And for us, we have three challenges. We are a highly vulnerable country to the climate hazards, physically and economically. The characteristics of our small economy, though improving, restrict our public spending to debt servicing and to other non-discretionary expenditure. So that's another big issue. And thirdly, I would say, for all of us, resilience building requires, access and to additional financing. And when we say access, it means that we're going to have to get over the usual barriers of the theoretical definition to the intricate details of how the technical experts are going to get that money out of the accounts and into the farmlands, into the water sustainability systems, and get it there in a timely manner. Because when it comes down to climate change, my friends, we can't wait 5 years to implement. So accessing financing is critical and has to be connected now to the short and medium term implementation that's required. So yes.
Go ahead, sorry.
No, I was just closing off by saying that our government, we are committed to investments that boost resilience by focusing on climate proofing, where our Prime Minister discusses digitization of our economy and society. And we've been very focused also on the expanded use of technology as an investment in our agriculture sector.
So there's the common argument that the likes of India, Bangladesh, many developing countries have long made, which is to say that growth is an imperative. In some cases, the primary imperative for these countries, because they need to feed people, they need to lift more people out of poverty. And that rapid growth often begins with dirty energy sources such as coal. Now, I'm not saying I agree with that logic, but that is the argument that is often put forward by developing countries. How does that resonate with yours and Jamaica's experience?
So for us in Jamaica, it is important for you to have growth, but strategic growth that recognizes our vulnerabilities, and employs a focus on sectors that will allow us to have, here the buzzword, sustainable growth. So we focus a lot on developing the structures and frameworks to use analysis so that our decision making and actions are very strategic. So recently we completed the preparation of our climate change research and technological development agenda. And that has helped us now to be able to drive our focus on priority areas like agriculture and fisheries, water, energy, waste management, which is a big ticket item, and how we settle our residents, meaning how we build climate resilient building. All of those require us to have sustainable growth. And so there is a big connection to accessing finance, a big connection to defining the right laws and parameters in policy, and also a big connection to ensuring that as we build from the bottom up, we are allowing everyone to play their own role in being able to sustain their life and to grow our economy so we can help in terms of mitigation, but more importantly for us as developing countries, so we can put the investment through growth into building our capacity to adapt and to be resilient when it comes on to being able to deal with the impacts of climate change.
I hear you. I'm just going to bring in a couple of questions from our global audience because they're watching and they want to get involved.
Yes.
There's one from an anonymous attendee, and the question is directed at you, Minister Charles. The question is any money spent on education to raise the new generation, not only with awareness of the environment and climate crisis, but also providing them with practical tools and preparing them for taking up the professions related to the planet's protection?
That is a very good question, and it actually frames, the discussion that we are having today around the need to drive the raising of awareness and to connect that now to raising of opportunities. So the simple answer is yes, but the extended answer is yes, but more is needed, much more. And so my ministry is the Ministry of Housing, Urban Renewal, Environment, and Climate Change. We interconnect around resilience, around sustainable development, and we are pushing now for the largest stakeholder network in the country to be developed around raising awareness for climate action so that every boy and girl understands their role and responsibility. Every corporate partner understands that they have to shift their operation towards recycling and repurposing and renewables. And as a government, that we become more efficient in how we operate, and also focusing now scholarships and opportunities to drive our very smart upcoming scientists and students towards the kind of jurisprudence and education that's going to allow them to become the innovators, not just of the future, but of the current. So we do, as I close, have several competitions to excite their imagination. We do also have opportunities from the ministry to partner with the private sector and drive scholarships in specific areas, but much more is needed. And that's part of the discussion that we're carrying to COP in the next 2 weeks. We are going there to have a bold discussion on how we are going to use the financing that we're sure we're going to come out of COP with a commitment for.
Now, Minister Charles, your country is also a beneficiary country of, multilateral funding agencies like SIF.
Yes.
How does your office ensure that investments from those kinds of groups, how does that sort of lead towards locally driven solutions, lead to sustainable solutions? Do you have any specific examples you could give us, perhaps?
Beautiful question again. So yes, we've been involved with SIF since 2010, and we've been benefiting from one of the most amazing programs called the Pilot Program for Climate Resilience, one of 4 SIF programs. Together, we have strengthened community assets. We've expanded exposure to climate smart agriculture techniques. We've improved access to water while contributing to sustainable livelihoods, particularly in climate sensitive sectors of agriculture and tourism, which are very, very important to countries like Jamaica. All the activities have been country driven. and responsive to the targets of our National Development Plan Vision 2030. And they have been accompanying our medium-term policy framework, which really now reflects how we drive the integration and participation in the planning of the public and private sector. So we recognize the value of the CIFs as a means to really couple our efforts and enhance cooperation between the ministries and the departments in government, so we can leverage the impact on the investments. And we've, as I said, we've really been doing a lot in terms of focusing on critical sectors. And there is a genuine spirit within even the NDC partnership, which you know that I coach here with the UK, around ensuring that what's being done in Jamaica can now translate across all of our members across the world, more than 200, where we want the NDCs and our targets to become the cornerstone of pulling our country's economic and development policies together towards sustainable development as a pathway. And what we're doing with CIF provides a solution to some of the most critical challenges faced by countries in transforming now the commitments that we have made into the tangible solutions to be implemented on the ground. That transition is very difficult, but we're getting it done by setting the framework. And as I close, we also have the galvanizing of support around our national adaptation plans, which is something we're doing in Jamaica. And through my role in NDC, we are now encouraging members across the world to complete their national adaptation program and to push for the commitments to really be implemented now locally.
Let me ask you this from your vantage point in Jamaica. And I grew up in India, and I speak often with people there. Do you think the developed world, the rich world, is doing enough?
Short answer is no. And it's not just the rich world. I think the world, including all of us, is not doing enough. When you understand how critical not doing enough is to our existence, when you come to truly appreciate the gravity of what we're speaking about today on this call, then it's very easy to not take a statement to say that we're not doing enough negatively. Instead, you take it constructively, and you appreciate the need for us to become more flexible, to become more urgent in our action, and to not just speak about 100 billion, but to make sure that 100 billion flows in a consistent and cogent way to achieve the outcomes. I always say this, making a commitment is the first step, but the next 99 steps are important to achieving the outcome. And we're not doing enough in really realizing those 99 steps. The rich world, the poor world, middle world, however you want to distinguish us, we are all on this planet together. And so I rather not distinguish us in that way, but say all of us have that responsibility. That's why Jamaica, despite being one of the lowest emitters, we have one of the most ambitious targets in terms of mitigation, because we appreciate that every single little step you take is important to reaching the finish line in the 5K that you're running. So all of us have to come together and appreciate the urgency and just start getting it done.
I hear you on that, but a related question, and this is something that my magazine and I have been thinking a lot about this year, is just how financing has changed. Mafalda mentioned this at the start when she was talking to me, and pointed out that some $16 trillion have been deployed to, in terms of stimulus as a step towards combating the COVID crisis. We now know from, the last 2 years of debates over COVID mitigation, but also through the last decade odd of dealing with the global financial crisis,
Yes.
that governments and central banks can actually deploy unimaginable sums of money when they need to. Is there a sense of frustration, though, in the circles that you take part in, both in Jamaica but globally through your work, that more money could be deployed? Is that, in a sense, the key frustration?
Undoubtedly, there is. I think at a high level, the discussion, however, thankfully, has now evolved beyond just frustration to a need for us to define what kind of specific actions are going to be required to create the access that is needed and to tear down the barriers to achieving the kind of support that's required for us to really get it done. The fact is that across the world, and particularly in small and developing states, in Jamaica, for instance, we have an effort to minimize fiscal risk associated with the occurrence of natural disasters, hurricanes, floods, etc. And so we are developing a national natural disaster risk financing policy that's going to provide comprehensive, coordinated, cost-effective, and timely disaster risk financing. Without the support of the international community, that will come to naught. And so it is important that we create the frameworks, we create the structures, and we are also pursuing a risk management approach to public-private partnership as well. So all of those policies are important. If the commitments we make in terms of the $100 billion and the large amounts that we're committing to are to be able to be efficiently deployed, as you have said. So yes, there's frustration, but I think that a lot is being done and has been done to put us on a track that we can move now towards getting that done for COP26 and beyond, and moving not just for 100 billion, but much more is going to be needed. 100 billion is a good figure, but when you look on the science and the empirical data, what it tells us is we are moving faster towards those negative outcomes than we expected 10 years ago. So the trajectories that we had 10 years ago that led us towards the estimate of 100 billion, those are no longer feasible. things are worse than we expected them to be. So it means we're going to have a reassessment of how the developed world and the developing world looks on these issues. We're going to have the reassessment of the policies and the multiple layers of instruments that we're using, whether it is catastrophe bonds, insurance, whatever we use. And we're going to have to raise our targets and raise our urgency if we achieve the outcomes that we need, not want.
Exactly. Well, Minister Charles, I wish you all the best in your endeavors now and leading up to COP26 and beyond. Thank you very much for your time.
I thank you. This is a wonderful and very important conversation. And I want to say to you, I respect the work that you're doing. You are helping us to achieve the outcomes that we need.
Right back at you. It's quite the opposite. We're just asking questions, but I thank you for your time and your efforts. Minister Charles. That was Minister Purnell Charles Jr., Jamaica's Minister of Housing, Urban Renewal, Environment, and Climate Change. Now, it's time to bring in our next set of panelists to explore the role that climate change plays in foreign policy and national security agendas, and how wealthy countries might work to increase their share in the climate fund to enable developing countries to make bigger climate change commitments. I'd like to welcome in Melanie Nakagawa. She's the Special Assistant to the President, that's the US President, and NSC Senior Director for Climate and Energy at the White House. And Thomas Anker Christensen, he is the Climate Ambassador for Denmark. Welcome, both of you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Terrific. Great to have you both
Hello.
on. Hi there. Great to have you on. I'd also like to remind our viewers around the world, I see more questions coming in, and I'm going to put them to our panel and to Mafalda at the end. But Melanie, let me start with you for now. Under the Biden administration, climate change mitigation is clearly back on the political agenda as a priority for Washington. So just so we can lay this out, tell us how climate change is also, from your vantage point, a foreign policy and national security issue.
Great, thank you so much, and really excited to be here with your audience and look forward to the questions and to be here with the ambassador as well. A real pleasure. You know, I think your question is exactly spot on, which is to share a little bit more about what's happening here in the United States, but also with this new Biden administration regarding how we're elevating climate among our national security and foreign policy priorities. This is a real sort of watershed moment for the United States and for this administration, as Mafalda opened up with such, kind of stark moments of the effects of climate change that we're seeing sweeping across the world, from the wildfires in the western United States, Turkey and Greece, and even Siberia, flooding across Europe, China, and South Korea. These kind of tangible, concrete examples of extreme weather events are really creating a heightened sense of urgency to why we need to take action this decade on climate. But it's compounded, frankly, by the recent August Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report that came out that found that there are specific extreme weather events can now directly be tied to the human-induced climate change, and leaves all of us with this deep sense of urgency to take immediate action. That scientific finding also, showed us that to keep the 1.5 degrees Celsius limit to global temperature rise within reach, we need to take urgent action, and urgent action in the 2020s. So those 2030 targets, what my colleague from Jamaica mentioned, it's the action right now for the next 10 years that are so vital to ensuring that we stave off those worst effects of climate. And these are truly national security and human security challenges. So we know the climate crisis, it's not something that's coming, but it's already here. And the science is undeniable about this. It's making it very clear that we need the policy development and decision-making to also address that. Mafalda's points about how do we bring, what the pandemic has showed us, the political will for extreme urgency and greater ambition. That's exactly the moment that we find ourselves in. And so on day one, President Biden came in with this mission, with this strategy, with this approach. On day one, we rejoined the Paris Climate Agreement to show the world that we're back at the table, that we believe in multilateralism, and that this is a key part of addressing our goals on climate. It would also be important to flag that in addition to what he did on day one, then by day 100, we convened world leaders for what we call the Leader Summit on Climate Change. He brought together 40 world leaders to a virtual summit focused solely on how do we increase climate ambition. Part of that group he convened was the major economies and the major emitters. This is, again, is a recognition that, we are 15% of global emissions, but 85% of emissions happens outside our borders, and that we really need the full world to come together, increasing ambition. So this year has really been a focus on, from day one to now, I think we're day 250 or something like that, about how are we working with partner countries around the world to steadily increase ambition so that we can emerge from Glasgow with a plan of action to narrow that gap, to close that gap to that 1.5 degree goal that is really important for it. Another key part about the national security component of this is today is actually quite an important day to be talking about it. Just earlier this morning, the White House released a series of analyses focused around climate security, starting with a national intelligence estimate from our 18 intelligence agencies talking about how climate change is a national security risk, and there's pretty much no area or country in the world that will be untouched by it. And therefore, we really need to think through how do we actually action that. We also announced that the Department of Defense has released their climate risk assessment. This is their view of taking in the best science that's available to understand how that's going to prepare them for mission readiness, for their own modeling and strategy and foresight planning at DoD, and how they integrate climate risk into that. Department of Homeland Security also announced their assessment report as well. And we released a seminal White House report on the impacts of climate change on migration. So this is today is a perfect time to having this conversation, because we announced today just a series of how we are truly integrating climate into our national security apparatus, but through the whole of government. It was not just the White House, it was several of our agencies and departments who have all come out with something to talk about how they're going to be taking the best science that we know to really implement and affect how we're thinking about the future challenges that are quite near term for many of us. So thank you so much for letting me answer that question, and I look forward to continued discussion.
Yeah, I'll come back to you with more, Melanie. Thanks for that. Ambassador Christensen, give us a sense of Denmark's climate goals this year. I know your country is working on finalizing its contribution to a global climate fund later this year.
Thank you, Ravi, and thank you for having me and Denmark in this discussion as well. Domestically, we're on a pathway to reducing our emissions by 70% in 2030. And we actually, we do see it as a challenge and in some ways as a big challenge, but we don't necessarily see it as a big burden. And while there are all the risks and all the challenges that Melanie outlined, we also see it as a big economic opportunity for actually leapfrogging into the 21st century with modernizing our energy systems, transport systems, agriculture, and so on. And in Denmark, we have created partnerships with the private sector across the Danish industry and business on how to drive renewable energy to scale, to decarbonize shipping, to produce green fuels, just to mention a few. And we're in a way taking that into our foreign policy as well, and creating a whole climate diplomatic effort around it, focused on energy cooperation with a large number of countries, both in the north and in the south, including China, India, South Africa, Korea, and in a way helping and supporting them in understanding how you can go to 100% renewable energy in your grid without losing energy security, and how that actually can increase your security. We have, Denmark has the highest energy security in Europe, with energy in our grid 99.6% of the time, most of it from wind, like the offshore windmill you see behind me. But we're also then increasing our funding for developing countries, for the kind of countries that Minister Charles talked about. We have pledged to fund more than 1% of the 100 billion that's on the table, promised to developing countries. We are, from our public grant money, going to spend more than 60% or 60% on adaptation for the most vulnerable. And overall, we're just focusing more and more on both supporting the most vulnerable with public funding, but also then in a way having that green economic revolution happening in the major economies in the South, who don't really need our development money. They don't need grants, but they need the same kind of economic incentives and the transformation of their economies that we're striving to have in Europe and in the US. So in a way, we have to work on all fronts to make this happen.
Melanie, let me bring you back in. It's so clear that the Biden administration has made climate change a priority, but if I were to push back against that sort of clarity as well, from our discussion with Minister Charles from Jamaica and from other conversations I've had with leaders around the world, it is also clear that this is simply not enough. And if you look at how the world, and especially the developed world, has tackled COVID so far, with immense vaccine inequity, there are many people at the WHO and elsewhere who have criticized the United States for its response and that it hasn't helped other countries enough. What do you say to people leaders in the developing world, private sector and public sector, who say that the United States could be doing much more, especially in a climate where financing has changed? We can see, given the domestic bills being discussed, that the numbers there far dwarf the kinds of numbers we're talking about when we talk about climate change mitigation.
Thank you for that question. It's important to put that in context as well, in terms of where we are in 2021 and specifically as it relates to climate change. When talking with world leaders on, particularly from vulnerable countries or those that are really focused on the climate finance component, we've heard that loud and clear. And an example of to discuss how loudly and clearly we heard it is in April at the Leader Summit on Climate. The president knew that climate finance is an important marker of our seriousness to which we address the climate challenge and the climate crisis and respond to the demands and needs of those around the world. The president announced a doubling of our international climate finance commitment at that Leaders Summit in April. But you're absolutely right. Since April, we continue to hear, but more needs to happen. Finance is such a key cornerstone of how we unlock some of the transition, the energy transition, the building resilience, building climate adaptation in key partner nations, that actually in September at the UN General Assembly, the president then once again pledged to double the double, right? So we came back in September to announce an additional doubling of our commitment to international climate finance, of which underneath that is a six-fold increase to climate finance dedicated to adaptation. And that, again, I think is a really important marker to highlight because, again, we know that this is not just about mitigation. Granted, we have tried to convene world leaders in the Major Economies Forum to focus on that 80% of global emissions that need to be mitigated. But at the same time, we're trying to drive more investment and finance towards adaptation and resilience, both here, but also around the world. And that is what underlies that six-fold increase on adaptation. So we know that the dollars matter. We also know that no matter how many billions we can raise in public capital, there's still trillions that are needed in private finance and mobilization. Secretary Yellen, we just finished bank fund meetings here in Washington, D.C. She's been very clear in her call to the multilateral development banks that we need to be doing better at catalyzing private finance with our limited public sector dollars, and has issued that call to several of the MDBs. So glad to be joining this discussion with Mafalda. The U.S. has been a supporter of the Climate Investment Fund and been a partner with them. We were able to rally, a language within the G7 and get G7 leaders to commit to support the Climate Investment Fund, specifically around the accelerating coal transition component in key countries that are dealing with exactly your other question of how do you handle the energy transition to the clean energy space. And things like the SIF and the accelerating coal transition work is a great example of then, again, to meet where the demands and needs are, to bring finance to the table, but to bring it mobilized with private capital. And I know that's part of today's discussion, but I would say the U.S. continues to think through all the creative tools we can bring to mobilize greater private finance. Our U.S. Development Finance Corporation, just a few years old, has made an early commitment. I think they are the leading development finance institution to say they're going to go net zero with a hard end date on their net zero target, as well as dedicating at least a third of their investment towards climate finance. So we are really trying to take every tool we have on the public sector side, mobilize as much as we can from private sector and private finance, working in partnership with many of these entities to really understand how do we go from the billions to the trillions that are so vital to actually showing a real impact and addressing the needs and demands that are out there. Thank you.
Thanks for that. Let me bring back in Ambassador Christensen. I'm just going to name check some of the terrific audience questions we have coming in. Ambassador, and hopefully you can answer a couple of them. Anindya Kulkarni writes that commentators have suggested an industry-wide mobilization towards green energy and technologies is required on a World War II level scale. Is this required? If yes, how can it be achieved? John Mueller asks that some top climate scientists have said there is no credible path to climate stabilization that does not include a substantial role for nuclear power. Do you agree? I think this question is especially relevant for Europe right now. Ambassador Christensen, your thoughts?
Well, Ravi, the last one, I'm the wrong person to ask. I'm from a country that has ruled out nuclear power. And we did that in the 70s, and we haven't really engaged in that conversation since. It's right that there are some European countries who are arguing that nuclear should be part of their mix, and we leave that very much up to them. We think nuclear is much more expensive to build than offshore wind. It takes much longer time, and it's so more risky in terms of what you do with the waste. So it's not something that Denmark is engaged in. On the first question, the reference to World War II and the Marshall Plan here, I think is correct, and it's also not correct. It's correct in the sense that we do need a global mobilization at a very large scale, but it's not a question of handouts. It's not a question of funding sort of a resurrection of the economy here. It is about systems change. We need to change our energy system, transport system, food production system, and in the end, the financial system, because everything we do right now is sort of fueled by fossils. We are in a world that depends on fossil fuels as an economy, and that's fundamentally what we need to change in order to meet the Paris targets, but also the challenge put to us by the IPCC on climate science. And without that systems change, we are headed towards a much different world within our lifetime and within this century. So,
well, Ambassador,
so
just
really
jumping off on Ambassador, just
Sure.
jumping off on that point you make. Your Prime Minister Frederiksen has written recently that she doesn't want emerging countries, emerging economies, to make the same mistakes as Denmark and other developed countries. I was wondering if you could just quickly run through some of Denmark's climate mistakes and how, what lessons from there can be passed on to developing economies.
What the Prime Minister is referring to there is really that many developing economies have the chance to leapfrog the fossil stage. Those who don't have modern energy systems at all can go directly to renewable energy-based energy systems, and those emerging economies, the ones Melanie also talked about, and I think Mafalda referred to, they can also choose differently than to build new coal. They can build wind, solar, hydro, and really pivot as they're building their systems. More difficult for the developed countries which have fossil-based energy systems throughout. We need to have a much deeper position in economies, whereas those that are still building their energy systems have the possibility to make different choices at the outset. That makes it cheaper and also makes the transition for the workforce easier. The 100 years of official development that we have. I think that's what the Prime Minister refers to.
All right, that makes sense. Let me bring back Melanie. Melanie, I'm going to put some questions from the audience to you. There's Mathilda Sada, who asks you, how do you think the inability to pass any major law regarding climate change before COP26 will impact America's voice and climate diplomacy internationally? She goes on to say, although it's not President Biden's fault, I'm not sure countries around the world understand the internal US challenges to pass laws. And another question, as you mull that one, from Thomas Campbell, who asks you, what role do you see for venture capital, especially Silicon Valley, in climate tech investments? How best to engage with the US government? Melanie.
Great, thank you. Just writing down this, I don't forget votes. So let me start with the venture capital. Prior to coming back into government, I spent several years raising a climate tech fund in the sort of the 2017 vintage, and would say I've been incredibly, impressed with the growth in technology. Just, again, it started several years ago. There's been various waves of the clean tech cycle, and I think that where we are right now in the role that venture can play is really quite important, because there is a unbelievable wealth of innovative technologies such as clean hydrogen, clean fuels, long duration storage, clean industrial processes, efforts for green steel, zero emission transportation. The list goes on and on and on. And I had the privilege and the pleasure of meeting with hundreds of companies that are all innovating solutions for the climate challenge, and that's where venture can play a role, is to help bring those companies to commercial, viability, to commercialization. And we're at this pivotal moment where there is, I think I saw one stat, maybe $16 billion in just this first half of this year alone was raised for climate technologies, venture, and private equity alone. So there's a lot of capital moving right now in this space towards innovative climate solutions. There's fantastic entrepreneurs and tech developers out there that are all focused and seized with how do we bring tons out of the atmosphere, how do we grow ag in a much smarter, cleaner fashion, the circular economy, how do we, try to do more with reuse, as well as really innovative ways for adaptation and resilience. So I am really bullish on the role that this industry and that sector can play in helping us actually get to the 2030, get to 2030 with countries all of hitting their targets, but then knowing to get to 2050 and that net zero target, for instance, the United States that we hit, we really need to see the commercialization of many of those technologies that are still fairly nascent. The Series A companies today need to be, getting to growth stage within that time frame. So we're really excited about the role that they can play. And to those that are tuning in, again, this is it's a very exciting time in the market. There's lots of opportunities out there, and they're phenomenal, globally sourced technology entrepreneurs that can really be part of this process. So the question about Congress, I think it's a fantastic question about Congress in particular. I think what's really important to highlight about U.S. law and U.S. Congress and the Biden administration's plans and goals is that earlier this year in April, President Biden set a commitment to reduce by over half, 50 to 52% below the 2005 levels by 2030. That is our domestic nationally determined contribution target. And what's important to highlight is where that was built from. That's built on several years predating January 2021 of effort and actions from cities and states, governors and mayors, businesses who have all taken action on climate for their own procurement decisions, their own clean energy deployment, and the things within their own borders and city states and their own counties to advance a climate forward agenda. And that's what has been built into that topic and built into that target, which allows us to put forward with credibility how we want to reach that goal. It's also really important to note that when it comes to congressional action, this is a key part of our path forward, but nothing rises or falls on congressional action regarding U.S. leadership. We've seen several opportunities for bipartisan engagement. We have various bipartisan packages. If you look at the last several years, you're seeing clean energy continue to be a growth sector in the market because, frankly, the non-political cycle influenced market participants are seeing the value and the economic driver for investing in clean energy and clean energy deployment. As the ambassador noted, this is really an opportunity message. The job creation that's coming from, I'm looking at the ambassador's offshore wind, we set a 30 gigawatt offshore wind target in the United States. The amount of jobs that are being created by that target is significant. Those are things that can't be undone in political cycles, nor should they be. And there's enough value and interest in it. So, we're going into Glasgow with what I believe is some strong tailwinds around the actions we've taken to date, the efforts and the actions that Congress, that our EPA has moved on super pollutants like hydrofluorocarbons, actions around methane to help, cap different types of wells and reduce methane emissions. So I think this is really, when we talk about the whole of government approach to the Biden administration, I'm not just talking about the cabinet and the political leadership within the whole of government. I'm talking about all of society and all of economy, whether that is, civil society, businesses, and states and cities, or we're talking about sectors, the power sector, transport sector, industrial sector. All of those entities and those elements are brought into what we mean by U.S. climate leadership. And many of those elements, if you think about it and parse them out, cannot be undone by political assistance and are not reliant or dependent on Congress taking action in a specific time frame. There are things that are embedded in our system, and there are things that, frankly, non-congressionally sort of engaged entities or touched, rather, entities can help continue to drive forward progress on. So thank you for that question. I think it's a really good one, but want to make sure we explain exactly how we view the role of Congress going into Glasgow, but also the opportunities we have that are outside the four corners of frankly, one of my former employers, which was Capitol Hill.
Right, exactly. Well, thank you for that answer. I'm afraid we're out of time on this particular segment, so I'm going to have to thank you both, Melanie, Ambassador Christensen. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much for having us.
Terrific. Well, that was Melanie Nakagawa, Special Assistant to President Biden, also NSC Senior Director for Climate and Energy at the White House, and Thomas Anker Christensen, the Climate Ambassador and Envoy for Denmark. Now, let's welcome back Mafalda Duarte. She's, of course, the CEO of CIF, the Climate Investment Funds. Mafalda, I know you've been listening and watching along. I have several questions for you as well from our viewers around the world and some of my own. We began this event a little bit late, so we're going to go a little bit over. But let me just ask you for initial reactions, if I can, Mafalda. Did anything surprise you in terms of what you heard over the last 45 minutes or so, given how much you deal in this space, but also what did we miss and what do you wish, what do you think we still need to discuss in terms of the road to COP26?
On the first question, was I surprised by anything? Not necessarily. I was listening carefully, and I think all of our colleagues, all of the speakers mentioned some really important points. From the Minister of Jamaica, I certainly retain something that I believe very much in, which is commitments are really important. They are a first step, but there's the other 99 steps. And I think we really need to focus going forward on action and bringing spotlight to action, to actually what is happening across developed countries, developing countries. How are we getting things done? How are we getting results? How are we achieving results so that those can be scaled up at a different pace? So certainly, and I also fundamentally agree with him that, and that's part of what you do as well, Ravi, and your team, and we try to do as well, and I think collectively we do, is convey this message that this is about collective action. This is about all of us embracing the responsibility that we all have. It's not just governments. It's business leaders, it's citizens. We all have an enormous responsibility and can do a lot, not just because we are consumers, but because we in democratic systems, we vote, we select our officials, we invest, we make investment decisions. We are raising children for those of us who have children. And so that circles back to the education point, which I also agree it's fundamental to really raise that awareness and make sure that all of the generations are very aware of the crisis that and the threats that we might be facing. From Melanie, she just stressed one point, which I also think is really important, and we try to bring awareness to this point, which is global collective action. We are not going to solve this in any individual country. It has to be about collective action. 85%, most of the emissions, as I was mentioning earlier on, are going to come from developing countries. It's in developing countries where most of the infrastructure investments will happen. We need to make sure that we are not locking in those investments in high carbon emissions and low resilience, because we know what then the economic costs of those types of investments are.
So Mafalda, if I may, just because I know we're almost out of time, I want to push you towards looking ahead to COP26 and, what in your mind would be a good outcome, given all of the restrictions and obstructions and problems that that we have, and you deal with this, in your day job, day in and day out. What strikes you at this point as the outcome you would like to push for?
What would be a good outcome is, and as Minister Charles was mentioning as well, is to see collective commitment from developed countries, because they have to lead the way, of course, and developing countries, to really see ambitious NDCs, ambitious targets. And another good outcome is to see commitments, strong commitments to support developing countries at this point in time, and not just because of the climate crisis in itself and the fact that they are disproportionately affected, but because at this point in time in history, they are even particularly more challenged because of the impact of COVID-19. So an ambitious package of support to developing countries. I think we will, and certainly we are bringing to COP what we hope is an important contribution. We will be launching 2 new investment programs in developing countries to support the energy transition agenda. One that Melanie alluded to, accelerating coal transition, which is really critical. I mean, this is another big message to everyone. And the UN Secretary General has brought that to light from a few years now, that it's not enough to invest in clean energy. It's critical that we support the phase out of coal, because coal still represents it's the largest source of emissions, and it's a lot more challenging to phase out from coal than make new investments in renewable energy. So we will be making, we hope to bring these contributions to COP and create that sense of hope and optimism. And also we will be bringing and we'll be engaged in discussions about how do we use this scarce public capital, and as Melanie said, to unlock the private capital. We continuously hear about this need, but we are not seeing enough movement in terms of really using the public capital to unlock this private capital at a much different scale. So we need new mechanisms, we need new tools, and we are ourselves working on such new tools and mechanisms. Of course, we need to see a lot more, but we also hope to bring that contribution to the COP. So that's, to me, what would be a good outcome for COP, is both ambition in terms of greenhouse gas emissions from all countries, to really convey this realization or recognition that this is a collective responsibility, and a commitment or ambition towards supporting developing countries, and particularly at this point in time where they are facing such challenges, both from a climate perspective and the COVID-19 pandemic.
Mafalda, that's a great answer. We'll be following your work very closely, especially over the next month or so, but I know in the longer term as well. Unfortunately, we have to end it there. We're out of time, but we know we're going to continue this conversation with you and many others. A great set of points from you and our other guests, lots of interesting new perspectives. And clearly there's so much more to explore on this front. We'll be paying close attention to all of that. To all our speakers, my pleasure to speak with you. Thank you very much for joining us. A big thanks to all of our viewers around the world. There were many more questions I wish I could have brought in. To name check a few quickly: Roni K. Odell, Seton Hall University; Calvin Johnson at the University of Maine; Andrea Nyamakie at Fletcher Tufts U; Charles Sharp. I see all of your questions. Samuel Adunreke. And hopefully we've managed to bring some of the points that you wanted us to address within our conversation. A big thanks again to the Climate Investment Funds for supporting this event, as well as FP Studio's excellent podcast, Heat of the Moment. Be sure to tune in. Season 2 is out now, and if you haven't heard Season 1, check it out. More info is available at foreignpolicy.com/podcasts. Thank you all for tuning in. A full recording of this event will be available shortly on FP's events page at foreignpolicy.com/events. You can rewatch this and share it with others. And there's lots more to come from FP in the coming weeks. On October 26 and 27, we're hosting our 3rd annual Global Women's Summit. It's called Her Power. Over the course of 2 days, you'll hear from an amazing lineup of high-achieving women, leaders and trailblazers, including Melinda French Gates, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, and many more. October 28, we're hosting a dialogue about the root causes of climate migration. That will feature Congressman Joaquin Castro and the mayor of Freetown, Sierra Leone, among other guest speakers. And then on November 10th, looking ahead a bit, Crypto's Impact on Global Finance will examine if digital money can build more inclusive economies. There's much more on our fall calendar. Stay tuned for updates. Again, that's foreignpolicy.com/events. Thank you for tuning in. This was, as ever, the most important issue we could be talking about. We'll keep a close eye on COP26 and the discussions leading up to that and beyond. I'm Ravi Agrawal. I'm Foreign Policy's Editor-in-Chief. It was my pleasure to be your host for the last hour. Stay tuned, take care, and see you soon. Thank you.